in a lot of stores and, of course, on the radio and just sort of around us. As soon as Halloween is finished, we jump right into Christmas to get decorated and sales and all those other things that come with this time of year. And, of course, as soon as Christmas Day is over, we'll just jump right out of that and, of course, move on to the next thing. Not much of a change, not really much really happening other than jumping in and jumping out very quick. And, of course, the church has a very different approach to Christmas Day. We are given this great season of Advent that is measured and marked out. And, of course, we use just a simple decoration of an Advent wreath to mark the progress of time as we get closer towards Christmas Day. Of course, today is a special Sunday within those 4 Sundays. It's called Gaudete, which simply means to rejoice. And that refrain will be happening all throughout all of our readings today and the prayers. We just kind of always that word to rejoice, to be thankful, to have that sort of confidence in our hearts that the Lord is near. Our gospel today is about John the Baptist. And of course, we had John the Baptist last week, who was acting very, very urgently that we need to change. There has to be a conversion of heart, that the kingdom is near. There's a great sense of urgency and a great sense of now. And yet today, John has a very different tone. He asks one simple question: are you the one? Should we look for something else? What happened from the time when John was out there with that urgency and that drive, and now this sort of question? And we don't really know exactly how many years went between these two events. But in between there, we do know John ended up in prison. He challenged King Herod, and King Herod threw him in prison. And so he's in this dark and scary place. But he still has this longing for God's kingdom. He spent his life preparing for God's kingdom and helping others to be aware of that and prepare themselves as well. And here he is, longing for it to finally happen and wanting it to really take place, and still has this question, still has this drive: are you the one? And he sends his disciples to Jesus, and he gives them a sort of a list of evidence. The blind see, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the poor have the good news proclaimed to them. He gives them this list of evidence that he is doing as the Christ, and sends those disciples back to John to give him that good news, to give him this list of evidence that is taking place in God's kingdom. So I think John had a very true and sincere question when he asked, are you the one? But our Lord asks some questions too, and I think it's almost like in a complete opposite, almost in a comical way. He asks those disciples who are left, what did you go out in the desert to see? A reed swaying in the wind? No, because when they went out to see John and be baptized by him in the Jordan, he certainly was not a reed swaying in the wind, but he was very clear: you need to convert, and also telling to Herod that you got a problem here. And of course, all that makes him end up in prison. Did you go out to see someone dressed in fine clothing? Of course, we know he just wore these rough animal skins and ate whatever he could scrounge off the floor of the desert. What did you go out to see? A prophet? And of course, the answer is yes. That John was that one preparing the way of the Lord. He was one who was pointing out that direction and calling his disciples to a conversion of heart. And he was having that deep longing for the coming of God's kingdom in its fullness. Now that we are a good halfway through this season of Advent, it is a good time to check in on our own spiritual journey. And I think it's good to take John's question to heart for ourselves. Are you the one? Evidence that he is the one is the fact that we are here this morning to celebrate this Eucharist. Something has driven us here that's longing for something greater in our lives, longing for God's mercy and forgiveness, longing for fellowship as good Christian people, longing to celebrate this Eucharist together is evidence of his kingdom. But I also think it's good to take that list that our Lord gave to John's disciples to bring back to him about God's kingdom and maybe turn it in on our own selves and see if this might help our Lenten, our Advent journey. The blind see. Do we have any blind spots? I think one of the most natural things that we do as human beings is probably the people that are closest to us, that love us the most, that we spend the most time with, we can sometimes take those people for granted. We fail to sometimes see them as they are. The deaf hear. We can close off our ears and not pay attention to perhaps what is going around us, maybe those who might need us one way or another. The dead are raised. Do we have any relationships, important relationships, life-giving relationships, necessary relationships in our own lives that have grown cold or perhaps need forgiveness, need some attention? The lepers are cleansed. Where do we need God's healing touch in our own lives? This is what Advent is all about. That deep longing for God in our lives, a deep longing for the coming of his kingdom, that recognition that we truly do need him. And so having that question of John the Baptist, are you the one, is a good refrain for us. But of course, to have the answer, yes, you are. And we need you. It's just as important. Our Lord ends this passage by saying that, John was this great prophet. Although born of woman, he's the greatest, and these great compliments to him, but yet he says at the very end, and yet the least in God's kingdom are greater than John the Baptist. How can that be? One way is the fact that one thing that we have that John the Baptist did not have is to live after the resurrection, to know of our Lord's victory over sin and death and darkness, that his sacrifice ultimately is our salvation. It was the coming of God's kingdom in a way that people did not expect, nobody was actually looking for, and yet it is exactly how God brings about his kingdom. The complete outpouring of his life, the complete outpouring of his love for us. And John did not live long enough to go through Pentecost, the outpouring of the Spirit. And what we are doing here this morning, coming here to celebrate this Eucharist, to receive our Lord in an abiding way, in a true and physical presence of him, to receive this bread of life within our own hearts, to hear his word, and of course to pray with and for each other. There is something great here. Our Lord's presence, the coming of his kingdom. And it's good to make sure we pay attention to what is going on, certainly in our own spiritual life, to be prepared in that way, but also to always have that longing for something greater, for something bigger, for that goodness that can only come from him. Are you the one? We can answer yes. We may need to do some work inside. This probably is true. But that's why God has given us this time to prepare, this time to have that longing and expectation. it does help us to be a better follower of His. To know that we truly do need Him, and He is truly here for us.